Today's podcast is supported by TRM. TRM enables compliance teams to accelerate business revenue and deliver actionable intelligence to regulatory and law enforcement stakeholders with leading attribution of severe risk categories. Request a free trial today at trmlabs.com. I'm Yaya Jata Finuse. Have you ever met a corporate whistleblower? Most of us haven't. They do make the subjects of great movies, though. There's intrigue, suspense, and high stakes, and usually a happy ending. But what exactly happens in real life when someone high up in a company, privy to corporate secrets, witnesses illicit dealings in their midst? How does that process play out? And at what cost, personally and professionally? Today's guest, Phil Brewster, runs his own boutique law firm out of Chicago, where his specialty is helping clients who've decided to become whistleblowers. He's seen a lot, he's heard a lot, and he's helped a lot. I recently spoke with Phil, who was able to walk me through one case in particular that shows how these high-stress whistleblower investigations most often involve great personal stakes that Hollywood can't fully convey. Phil Brewster, are you ready to get designated?
I generally don't like the sound of that when someone's talking specifically to me, but for you, yeah, I'll do it. Let's go.
All right, welcome. Phil, I know you once said that people come to you after the worst day of their life. What do you mean?
Yeah, what I mean is this. Short of someone's family member dying, if someone is going to come and call me, it's because something terrible has happened at work that they have discovered and have become involved in criminal or regulatory misconduct that threatens potentially their freedom. They could be confused as a potential participant in a crime, and they are nervous and afraid. They have likely talked to somebody at work about it, and those people have not listened to them. They have probably been ostracized because of it, potentially fired, and it's been weighing on them for a lengthy period of time, likely months, and they are really afraid, they're really isolated, and frankly, the way I describe it, it's when you meet me, it's like the end of the line, and you get off the bus, and you get to talk to me about your problems. And I always tell them that, today's going to be the hardest day, it'll be the worst day, and every day going forward as we work on your problem, we'll get better. And that's been my experience probably with every person that I've represented in a whistleblower program.
Well, Phil, why you, if the stakes are so high in these situations, why are they coming to you and they're not going to the authorities?
That's a good question. So sometimes they do go to the authorities and talk to someone. That happens. And I have found, though, that on the whole, most of these people are fairly educated, smart, C-suite level or senior vice president level person, and they're going to think about really hard and investigate their situation. They're going to be really anxious, and I like to think about it like it's the WebMD approach to like health problems. Like if you have a health problem, you're going to go on the internet and you're going to do research. You're going to look into it. And if you're in a situation like I'm talking about, where you're at the center of illegal or illicit conduct, you're going to go and study your problem. That's the nature of the kind of client that will come and find me. They'll go do work. They'll figure it out. They're hardworking people. They've gotten themselves into a problem. They're smart, and they're going to work to try to find a solution. So they go on the internet, they learn about the programs, and they study, and they realize that a lawyer can help them. And sometimes they've gone and talked to the authorities, but then they realize even after that encounter that they really need a lawyer because the government, when they engage with you, they're very hands off. I mean, they're trying to figure out who you are. They're trying to understand who you are as an individual, like what's your story? And you don't have a lawyer there to kind of help and guide and prepare for that meeting. So, they'll usually quickly turn around after that meeting and find a lawyer if they haven't done so before.
So these whistleblowers, the people that you interact with, I mean, you said that they're usually folks professionally who are at a high level. Is there anything else that makes them different, that distinguishes them from other executives?
Yeah, I think there really is a distinction of someone that's willing to do this. It's a very difficult process. So I have found characteristics in my clients that tend to be universal. One, I find them to be very thoughtful, very principled, and they have very developed, keen moral compasses. And they also have a belief in the system. They have a belief in the rule of law, and they are willing to stand up for that. And I think that's what differentiates them from other employees that encounter problems and they're not really willing to dig into it, and there becomes sort of a cognitive dissonance that develops where they rationalize the problem away, and that happens commonly. I mean, companies regularly get in trouble. Very sophisticated companies get in trouble for situations that in retrospect look like, how could that ever happen? The consulting firm McKinsey recently just settled over $500 million for their involvement with the opioid crisis. And one thinks, how does the world's greatest consulting firm get involved in something like that? And I don't know anything about that case, but I'm talking about the kind of groupthink that takes place, the sort of rationalizing away of problems. The individuals I'm talking about don't do that. They confront and grapple with difficult issues. They're not afraid to. And it's mainly because they have a belief in the system. They have a good moral compass. And that's what drives them to raise their hand up. And I'm usually a sea of many people to be maybe the only one who says, hey, we got a problem here. So that's what I would think distinguishes the people that I've worked with. And I can't speak for every whistleblower lawyer out there that has had clients. My experience is, based on the cases and controversies that I've been involved in, but that's the peer set that I've encountered. And those are the characteristics I've found.
And you've dealt with a lot of cases of whistleblowers. Can you walk us through, one, an exemplar case that you can talk about? Walk us through what happened.
Sure. So the case that I can talk about, and my client is authorized to talk about, involves Morgan Stanley and Interactive Brokers. And if you've recently read the Wall Street Journal, you will have discovered that Morgan Stanley is under investigation for AML deficiencies. And I think a good starting point, to this and is to understand a little bit about, what the money at issue was involved and what country was involved. And I think, if we could just lay out a little bit of background so we get to where my client jumps into this, will make a lot more sense to people that aren't AML experts, that gives some color to the country, the money, the people involved. So this involves, and my client's disclosure to the government about money laundering involves Venezuela. And I don't know if you find this, but every time we talk about the worst countries in the world, the most corrupt, it seems like, Russia, China, North Korea, Somalia, you name it. Venezuela is always there. It's always there. And just to give your viewers a sense, last year, the most corrupt countries in the world, the worst was Somalia. It was dead last. There's 3 at the bottom tied for second, and that was Venezuela, South Sudan, and Syria. To give you a sense, that means that Russia, China, and other countries you may think of as corrupt are actually doing a little bit better than Venezuela. Venezuela, over the last 20 years, has turned into a kleptocracy, and the country is effectively bankrupt and defunct. And that happened because of an oil company named PDVSA. Venezuela, and this may surprise people listening right now. Everybody, if I ask folks, where's the largest oil reserve in the world? Everybody would say Saudi Arabia, instantaneously. That would be the country. It's actually wrong. The largest proven reserves in the world are in Venezuela. When you add in conventional reserves and the oil in the Orinoco River Valley, which is a heavier, more sulfur-driven product, Venezuela is on top. In the Western Hemisphere, it's number 1 in conventional oil, more than the United States. And so what happened was that was all nationalized. And then through an absolute, unapologetically socialist political regime, they started providing social programs. But the problem was PDVSA, the national oil company of Venezuela, also became a political arm of the Venezuelan regime run by cronies of the government. Let's just say they didn't do a very good job running the company. Oil plummeted in terms of production. And then the social welfare programs that relied on it faltered. and then it turned into a failed state effectively. And at the same time, the government officials stole roughly, and there's no known number now, but about $300 billion. And that's a number that I've heard. And I just want to give you a sense of like how much kleptocracy was going on, just like a flavor for how bad Venezuela was. They took Russian freighter planes and put 7 tons of gold and flew it to Uganda and basically smelted it, rebranded it non-Venezuelan treasury bars, and sold it. And no one can find that money. And that gold came from actually World War II when the U.S. was buying oil from Venezuela for the war effort. And the Venezuelans demanded gold. That was the only thing they would accept. And they stored those in the treasury there. And during, the time of Nicolas Maduro, the current president, that was all stolen. That's how bad it is in Venezuela. The president himself, Nicolas Maduro, he has been charged as a narco-terrorist by the United States government in 2020 for helping the FARC produce cocaine. So it's an absolute failed state. Now, how do we get from my client, an American citizen, going to the government and talking about that? Well, there was a guy named Luis Rodriguez. He worked for 2 ministers of the Venezuelan government. And one was the head of PDVSA, that's the Venezuelan oil company. And one was actually the ambassador to the UN. And what he did was he laundered about $2 billion to a small bank in Andorra. Now, Andorra is a tiny country most people have never heard of. Yeah. I won't lie. I had to go look on the map. I'm not going to say that, that I didn't. It's between France and Spain, and it's tiny. You could drive through it. You could ride through it on your bicycle probably in a half hour. That's how small it is. And he moved all that money there. And eventually, because they were living very lavishly, this gentleman, Luis Rodriguez, they were in Paris spending insane amount of money, staying at the Georges V, the Ritz-Carlton, and the best hotel in maybe potentially the world, spending $500,000 on hotels. Eventually, French intelligence and other intelligence agencies and law enforcement tried to figure out who these people were and what they were doing. And eventually they would seize all that money in Andorra. But before that happened, they bribed one of the bankers there to release money, and they released $200 million. Now, just to give you a little context, the U.S. Treasury Department deemed Banca Privada Andorra, that was the bank, and a primary money laundering risk under Section 311 of the Patriot Act, and it basically finished the bank off. But by that time, this money had moved, and it was moved and moved into the United States. And so we're almost there to where my client stepped into the thing. So it will make sense. I promise when we get through this line of explanation, it will make sense.
I'm following the line. I'm following. Good. It's good.
So there's a company in Barbados called Energy Risk Condemning. Lo and behold, Luis Rodriguez happens to be the shareholder. The fancy word for it is he is the ultimate beneficial owner. He's the UBI. And anybody in the industry knows exactly what I'm talking about. He's the shareholder. I have the documents that can prove that he's the shareholder. I have his passport. I have all those bits for my client. That money moved for the benefit of ERI to Morgan Stanley through Mexico. How do I know this? Morgan Stanley filed a SAR, suspicious activity report, explaining all of this. So I'm not saying anything that Morgan Stanley didn't tell the government to this point. So that money moved into the United States between October 2014 and October 2015. And Morgan Stanley eventually reported to the government in 2016. Now, and then into 17, the money remained at the bank and would ultimately move to another company, another bank called Interactive Brokers, which is a U.S. brokerage firm, very large one of the largest electronic brokerage firms in the world. So the money was at Morgan Stanley. There was a SAR issued. The money is moving. It's moving out, and it's going to go to Interactive Brokers. Now, my client joined a firm in 2018. At that time, the money that was at Morgan Stanley, that Morgan Stanley filed a SAR and explained to the government about their risk and its connections to Banca Privada Andorra and its ties to two of the most well-known kleptocrats in Venezuela, they let that money go, and it goes to Interactive Brokers, and my client joins a firm who's advising that money. He didn't know any of this when he joined the firm. He joined as the chief compliance officer. So does this make sense? I'm trying to give you kind of a sense of like where this money came from, how radioactive it is, how the money moved, and how it ends up in the United States. And now my client is the chief compliance officer at an investment advisory firm in the United States, and he's doing his homework over accounts. That's his job.
And if I can step in here at this point, right, that you're chief compliance officer. So, I assume his role is to, assess that all the procedures are being followed so that if there is anything questionable, risky, that it's dealt with in a certain manner, that there's due diligence that's done, that certain things are reported, because he knows, especially as chief compliance officer, right, he's responsible. And so this person should know when something's wrong.
He's liable if something's wrong. In fact, just to give you an example, the AML chief compliance officer had a regulatory action against him at Interactive Brokers, the very firm we're talking about, because of a failure on his part to oversee the AML program. So my client had personal liability. He had skin in the game, and he took his job seriously because he's a reputable human being. Going back to what I talked about earlier about the type of person, hardworking. They follow the rules. They've put in the work to rise the ranks. They're members of their community. They're not troublemakers. They're there to earn a living and to do their job.
He's chief compliance officer. He's noticing something seems adrift. He's evaluating the documents. And so what happens?
Like any good chief compliance officer, you start to go through all your client files. And I think what any compliance officer would do is start at the largest ones and the big ones that have the biggest influence and present the greatest risk to the firm, and that risk is doing business with the firm. It also could be that you have a client that has leverage over the firm if they do something wrong. So you need to be careful. It's not just like facilitating bad conduct. You don't want to be in a situation where your largest client has leverage over you. So, compliance has kind of a multifaceted aspect to it that you have to be really careful with who you're dealing with, because they both can taint you and have leverage over you. And you don't want to get into those situations. You want to avoid that from ever happening. So we started to research the largest client, started to look into it, the background, where it came from, the history of the money. He had all the files, the entire history, and he started looking through it and realizing who these people were. That, in fact, the members of the board of directors of ERI were PEPs themselves, and PEPs are politically exposed people. So the members of the board of directors, excluding the gentleman Luis Rodriguez, were also people that were very suspicious from a PEP standpoint, that they presented risk of potential corruption, yes, because they were tied to and affiliated with government officials. So you have that. He noticed that. He was looking into Luis Rodriguez. He's looking at Venezuelan passports, and he's looking at the history of what's happened in Venezuela, and he's deeply concerned. So he raises these concerns at the firm, and he gets pushback. At this very same time, the firm is also moving to liquidate the account. The account is going to disappear. It's going away, and the money is going to go offshore. My client at this point has figured it out. He's deeply concerned, and he is worried that the firm is not operating in normal fashion. It's not doing with this very large account, which was what you would do. You would sit down and you would plan. You'd have meetings. You'd have in-person time with people. None of that was occurring.
Phil, what was the pushback that he received? He raised these concerns, and what was he told?
He was told that there was nothing to see, that this was all legitimate, that the individuals that he was talking about and the concerns he raised were figments of his imagination, that they were not real, that he had it wrong, that he didn't understand things. And that was it. And also what I found in whistleblowing, there's a tendency to demonize the whistleblower, to make the whistleblower doubt oneself, to make oneself think I'm just having crazy thoughts effectively, to undercut the sort of credibility and the mental state of the person that you're talking about, to make them feel like I'm doubting myself. Maybe they're right. I'm wrong. I need to back off of this. And that sort of campaign that he felt very intensely. And like what I was saying earlier about the characteristics of the clients I work with, he eventually turned around and said, no, I'm not going to do that. And he called Interactive Brokers himself, and he said, I have real concerns about this account. He called the bank. He said, hey, you need to look at this. And at that point, he had sort of crossed the Rubicon. Once you do that as a compliance officer, you're going to be looking for another job. But because this money was going to move offshore and he was certain about its illicit origins, he did what needed to be done. And he also made another very bold step in my mind, is he called the SEC by himself. And he called a regional office, and they took the call. They spoke with him. They called him right back. And they sat down and had a long conversation with him. And he provided all the information that he had in his position at that time. And then he lost his job. As you could imagine, that would happen very quickly. He moved to basically lock the account, and that didn't go over very well. And he lost his job. He was fired, and he was very traumatized by that whole experience. He had had a long career in the investment world. He had never had any prior incidents of misconduct or anything that you would find. I mean, most of the clients I deal with had never had contact with law enforcement or a regulatory issue. For them, this is a first time, and it was very much in his case what he encountered.
So he lost his job, and this is after he went to the SEC. So things really have fallen apart for him personally. How does walk us through then what happens and actually how he ended up with you?
People get really nervous if they reach out by themselves to the government and they talk to someone and then the government doesn't call them back. That, I think, is probably more nerve-wracking than anything else. Than you've gone and talked to somebody and now they're not talking to you and you don't understand why. And that, I think, for a lot of people who are uninitiated into this is gut-wrenching. That's what he encountered. That's not unnatural. I wouldn't say I wouldn't read anything into that. I actually think that's standard playbook for the government. And so he reached out for counsel, and I got involved and started investigating the case. I do a standard interview. I sit down with people. I get kind of assess, if this is real. Most of the time I say no. I mean, to be frank, most cases, they're not really meritorious. Most of what I'm doing is filtering through lots of calls from people that think they have something and they don't. They're nice people, but it's not worthy. They don't have the start to finish story that the government's going to be interested in. And so in a way, I do the government a favor because I sit down and I spend a lot of time that they otherwise would have to spend with people. And then I filter through. But this story was absolutely rock solid from the moment that I talked with the client. And I actually tried to trip the client up. I use some basic interviewing techniques to see if am I getting spoofed, or is this puffery? Everybody wants to have a great case. No, I couldn't. And I couldn't move him 1 inch. And I realized that he was a very tough guy and he was a smart guy and that he wasn't lying. And he had a stack of documents. He had all the account records. He had all the internal documents from the company in Barbados. He had the passports. It was the full, complete picture. You don't usually get that. Getting internal board meeting minutes of companies, are very rare, especially, when you go into the Caribbean reinsurance. Those sorts of Caymans, BVI, you're just not going to get your hands on that. He had it all because he had the files. He was the chief compliance officer, and he diligently kept it all.
And reading between the lines, I don't know if you can say this or not, but I'm reading between the lines. At this point, he has been fired. He's no longer with the company, but he still has evidence within his possession, which would be needed to take this case forward.
Yeah. He walked out with the information with the documents within his control, he left with. And whistleblower laws allow you to do that. Now, it's a complicated topic. You're not allowed to keep everything, and you can't work at a big company and copy the entire server and leave. That's actually a risk factor. If you want to talk about risk factors, that's something not to do. But yes, he had the documents. He kept them. He was smart about it. And it mainly to protect himself. I think in the beginning, it's fair to say that the client didn't want to get confused as a target of an investigation. And so the best to do is keep the evidence to prove that you're not the bad guy. And so, but we had the evidence. And then from there, you start an investigation. And I use the mosaic method. That's just how I look at things. And I don't mean there is a mosaic method used in criminal threat assessment. I don't mean it like that. I mean it in a very simple way. I think of it as I'm looking at a picture and I only have a few bits of what I can see. I know behind all the dust that there's a full image. And what I want to do is start to, where I can uncover certain parts of it to start to develop a picture. And I'll never get the full picture. I don't get that. I don't have the resources that you had when you worked at the government. I don't have those databases. I don't have those resources. But using open source, given what the client has and open source technologies, you're able to kind of peel back what's there. And we did that. Eventually you work and you create what looks like a court filing, a detailed brief with all the evidence, and you file it, in this case with the SEC. And that started the process, gets the client on the clock and the program, and that's how you formally become a whistleblower. And so that's like the next step in the process. You work very closely with the client. This is a very intense part of the process where they help you figure out what happened. You tell a story. You try to craft a story that if you're a government enforcement official, you want to tell a story that's interesting. That with your limited resources, we can't look at everything. That's the job as the lawyers to help lay that out. It's also the job of the lawyer to explain who the person is and explain the background of the person, because my experience has been the first person who gets investigated in a whistleblower case is the whistleblower by the government. They want to know who this person is. Can we trust this person? If they're going to be a source, we need to know that they are not going to later just be a grenade that goes off and destroys a case. So we're working on that. We're trying to build up the credibility of the whistleblower. We're trying to present to the government a witness and a story that they can be interested in, believe in, and tell them that, hey, look at us. And that's what happened.
And I want to hear, then what you all did. I mean, you're compiling the story and the facts and putting everything together. But earlier you mentioned that it's standard procedure for the government to not follow up. And why? Is it because they're looking into this person as a possible part of the problem?
So I would clarify this. I think the government will follow up. I just think that clients expect it to be like instantaneous. And I think that their timeline is not reasonable. They just don't appreciate what's happening. So I think when you file, the government's they're going to do an initial investigation before they would ever call you. And most of the time they look at it and they decide, no, we don't need to do something here. This just doesn't rise to our attention level. And in a program that, like a whistleblower program where there's not court filings, like in some of the other whistleblower programs, they don't have any duty to do so, to respond to you. You're not a party in a proceeding, like in some of the other cases and types of whistleblowing. You may not hear a response, but here they will call you back. And they did call us back. And interestingly, the pandemic struck. And what I thought was so interesting in all of this is that we filed this in December of 2019. The pandemic struck in March. And the government was interested. They called back and said, hey, we want to talk to you. Now, we did one other thing is that in this case is that we brought it to the Department of Justice. So we went to the SEC, we filed it there, and then we gave the entire briefing to the Department of Justice. And we said, hey, you should look at this and you should take this very seriously. And they did. And even in the middle of the pandemic, I remember this very vividly, Yaya. I flew someplace when no one was supposed to fly anywhere. And I was at O'Hare by myself. I was like alone at the airport. And if you've ever been to O'Hare, that's a really strange experience.
Yeah. I kind of miss those days of not a lot of people in the airport, but
yeah, it's not like that now. But I remember going, there was no one in the security line at O'Hare, which is like crazy. Yeah. And I got on the plane, I flew to this location. And at this time, there was a lot of civil unrest. This was a major metropolitan area. It was really not safe to be on the streets at night. I mean, it was a really wild time. And we briefed the client. We spent a lot of time with the client, sitting down kind of like where we are here, talking about things, how to answer questions, like, what do you do? And then we went to the government. And, no one's doing in person. No one's doing anything. And we went into the press room of the government, of a U.S. Attorney's office. And they have little desks like separated out, if you remember that time period. And one desk was the FBI, one desk was Homeland Security, one desk is the U.S. Attorney, and then the SEC. And we're all in this room and we're talking. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a very important case if we're doing this. If we're here in person, our client's here and we're doing this. And so that's how that case progressed. And there was a long interview, and from there, we continued to do a lot of research and started supplementing our filings with the government with information that we found, kept developing the case, using that mosaic method, kind of peeling things back, using, there's software technologies that you can use or that are open source to help you connect relationships. We started to peel all of that back. And this was a tremendously large network. And we fed all that information to the government.
So you're feeding this, and bring us back to even connecting the line to where you started with Morgan Stanley, because that's sort of in the background. So
Yeah.
what is it that you're piecing together as it relates to Morgan Stanley at this point, and then what starts happening?
Yeah. So, I mean, the fundamental premise of our referral to the government was that both at Morgan Stanley and Interactive Brokers, they had accepted funds from kleptocrats, that their AML programs were deficient, and our allegations are that happened. And so that's the focus of everything we're working on. It's feeding to explaining how these people pulled this off. And if you're going to allege that bad people brought bad money to a bank, you need to explain why they are bad people. Why is this illicit funds? These are not easy standards to meet. These are very serious charges. And so to explain that to the government, to give them the background, to show them how bad this is, and that in fact it is what we say it is, that's what we're trying to give to them, because then they have the resources and the power to look at things in ways that we simply cannot. And at the time, I didn't know about that SAR. That SAR came from the FinCEN files, which was a leak that you're probably familiar with. It was someone who worked at Treasury and left with an immense amount of SAR. She went to jail for that, actually. She actually went to prison for disclosing all that information. But in that stack that she left was the SAR, was the intelligence report at FinCEN that proved what we were saying was true. I didn't know that at the time. I mean, we're working and trying to prove this is true. And then I read the SAR later on going like, okay, we hit the nail on the head here. This is great. But that's fundamentally what we're driving at. Your question was, we're trying to show and we're trying to prove that bad money went to a bank where it shouldn't have gone.
Mm. And so, what was the end result? I mean, with your client, with the whistleblower, and then how did you all bring this to a final result?
Well, it's not final. It's not
Mm,
final at all.
mm,
So to give you a sense of what's happened, so we did all that work with the government, and then we felt that the case was very important. The client felt the case was very important, and this is not something that I regularly do, but has become a larger part of my practice. And it's not something I do with very, very few of my cases. This case we thought was particularly important and had a particular public resonance to it. And so we contacted the Wall Street Journal and an individual named Ian Tolley. Ian Tolley was the illicit finance reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And we did that in January 2021. So we had been working for a long time with the government, and then we made a decision to move and talk to the media, which was not lightly taken by any means. And then Ian Tully was fascinated with what we had to say. He had been following this for a very long time. He had written a story actually about the Venezuelan gold smuggling that I mentioned, and all the other kind of kleptocracy that Venezuela was involved in. So we gave him the information of our case. He was fascinated by it. But yeah, it was a long road with the Wall Street Journal to get that published. As I mentioned, we went there in January 2021. It took until the fall of that year to get it published. And I felt like it was probably one of the hardest things I've done professionally to get that across the finish line. The standards at the journal were very high. Editorially, the allegations were very serious, and they were not going to make those allegations without stone cold confidence that was true. And Ian Tully got it done, and that story broke, and it continued. And Ian Tully, in fact, he actually left the journal. He's no longer with the journal. He started his own company now, and we talked to another journalist there named Anna Maria Andriotis, and she was not an illicit finance reporter at all. She was actually a consumer reporter, like consumer finance was her specialty, and she got moved to the desk of Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs in the fall of 2023. And we reached out to her, asked if we could talk to her. We said, we have something very interesting you should talk about, and you should talk to Ian Tully. And
Moved to the desk. Moved to the desk, meaning now she covers Morgan Stanley
yes,
for the journal. Okay.
for the journal. So she's covering Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. That's all she covers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's we reach out to her, we make contact, and we say, hey, can we just talk with you and show you what we have? You're on the desk, and so this is we think a big issue. And went to the Wall Street Journal headquarters in New York, gave the presentation, And she was not a money laundering expert. I will say that was not her background. But she's a very diligent reporter, and she was able to uncover by November of 2023 that the Federal Reserve was investigating Morgan Stanley for AML deficiencies. She would follow up with reporting in April of 2024 about further investigations by SEC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, FinCEN, which is the U.S. Treasury's enforcement arm, and what was going on there and how long and protracted the problems were starting in 2020 up to and including 2022 to 23 to 24, and the great efforts that Morgan Stanley was making with the government to address, but in many ways not meeting it. That all culminated actually, with a very long article that was published in December of this year, just recently, and was on the sort of the front of the mast about the global issues that Morgan Stanley was having in its AML problems. And so the issues that we discovered way back in 2019, and then we started then slowly boiled to the surface through a lot of persistence and a lot of dedication and commitment on the part of the client to follow this through to the bitter end. And some of the problems that I can just give you just like a sense of some, and this is for reporting from the Wall Street Journal. I'm just restating the work of Anna Maria, that something like 46,000 of their international wealth accounts were deemed high risk or high risk plus. Over half of the accounts in 2023 had errors and missing documents. And 2023, they had an account which they ended up closing, but they allowed the account to open for a gentleman that was actually indicted for lying in a terrorism investigation involving Al Qaeda and the bombings in Africa. And that he actually had an account at Morgan Stanley, one of the subsidiaries, E-Trade, and they shut that down. But the fact that those sorts of things were slipping through, it was the fact that they didn't have Spanish speakers in a global wealth management firm that was expanding into Latin America. They were using Google Translate to translate documents to understand what those were. They were hiring temps to read documents. They didn't have, at least in my opinion in the reading, the cultural staff that they needed to really understand the business that they were doing. Spanish speakers, people who were familiar with doing business in Latin America. They were in a growth phase. Morgan Stanley, after the great financial crisis, really focused on wealth management as a steady business. And it's a supercharged their growth, their earnings. And I think what happened was along the way, and this is just my opinion, they didn't put in the proper foundation to manage the risk of having a global wealth management firm. For example, not meeting clients in Latin America, simply opening accounts without ever meeting a person. I mean, to me, I think that speaks volumes to the sort of risk assessment, the risk tolerance they were willing to sort of live with. And I think that, was very dangerous, and it has now caught up with them. So
I want to just ask about your client, because what you just described is almost, it seems like you all planted a seed that others were able to follow, because the government was starting to look at it. The media was uncovering things that maybe you all didn't even know about. So now things, as the years have gone on, things are now in the public. So how does your client feel, or how did your client start feeling when this became uncovered?
I think my client felt vindicated. I think going back to what I said earlier about the nature of the clients, I think that his struggle was proven worth the effort. It proved that he was right, and that he stopped conduct that threatened the U.S. financial system, that he was able to make a difference. And I think that's what a lot of my clients have. I mean, they look at the world, they have in some ways a richer understanding of like what it means to be an American. We're a country that has tremendous liberties. We have, some of the best individual rights and the ability to live those out pretty much anywhere in the world, thinking of the expansiveness of our First Amendment. And I think that this client particularly saw on the other side of that, the obligations that come along and living in that system, that if we're going to have a system like that, that we have to tend it, we have to take care of it. And that what he was doing was stepping up to make sure that the system would still function. And I think it was a very brave act. And I think it's something very, very special. Not many people are willing to do it. But I think that that's really where it came from, that he felt in the end that the effort that he gave and the suffering and the name calling and the bad words that were said about him and the smear campaign, that it just didn't stick. And he was able to make a difference. And I think that that's fundamentally an American thing. I mean, yeah, if you look at whistleblower programs in Europe, they're very weak, anemic. They're not very functional. Most people that have a good claim come to America to bring that claim because usually the jurisdiction here. I mean, we just have a very strong whistleblower, sort of, I guess, spirit here. And I think it speaks to who we are as Americans, as individuals that feel like we can talk to our government.
TRM offers leading blockchain intelligence for AML compliance at financial institutions, crypto businesses, and regulatory organizations alike, with sanction support on 65 blockchains and coverage of more than 70 million digital assets. In a recent customer survey, 85% of users agree that TRM accelerates their work. 92% of users agree that TRM provides actionable intelligence, and 83% of users agree that TRM has provided intelligence they would not otherwise have. See for yourself why customers rave about TRM by requesting a free trial or demo at trmlabs.com. I don't know that most people even know much about whistleblower programs, and that there's actually a potential reward if you successfully bring forth a whistleblower case. Tell us about that. Tell us about the potential reward.
Yeah, sure. So I look at it, I kind of divide the world in whistleblowing in America into two buckets. The first one is fraud in the federal government, and that's called the False Claims Act. And it comes from the Civil War. It's called Lincoln's Law, and it was to prevent fraud on the U.S. military and its acquisition. That's the big program that's been around for a very long time. You actually file a lawsuit, you have to be a party in litigation, and you can't talk about it. It's under what we call seal. And those go on for a very long time. But you have to have fraud in the government. And it's very particular. You have to plead it in a very particular way. It's a very technical statute, and you have to have a lawyer to do it. You're not allowed to just bring a case like that on your own. Because you're bringing a case on behalf of the United States government, you need a lawyer you can't represent another person, so you have to have a lawyer to essentially bring the case on behalf of the U.S. government. And you stand in the shoes of the government in those cases. Those cases have a success rate of about 20%, okay? It's not bad, but there's a lot of filtering that goes on with the lawyers to think about which cases that they'll take, that they're going to engage in. Now, on the other hand, there's a whole slew of other programs. The big one, I think, is the SEC program. It's been around since Dodd-Frank, so about 2011, 2012. And it's been a very successful program. I'll give you a statistic. I'm not, these are some estimates, but since 2011, about $1.9 billion have been paid out to whistleblowers, to about 400 individuals. It makes out an award of about $4.75 million. Now, some people, you can go after my math on that. It's a rough estimate. I'm telling you, I'm a lawyer, not an accountant. That's based on, but here's the thing. That's based on about 80,000 tips. So the success rate, when you figure out 400 people made it through to get to a reward, that's less than 1%. So the success rate is very low. You are signing up for, terrible odds. The other programs that are out there, you have the IRS program, you have the Commodities Futures and Tradings Commissions program as well. That's very similar. Treasury's come up with a new program. It's only been around for about a couple of years. It's very new. These programs take a long time to kind of stand up. And then this summer, actually, the Department of Justice came out with a very similar whistleblower program with rewards. And it's kind of to fill in where there may not be a program for somebody to join. So, for example, like foreign corruption, this comes very much to the kind of audience that you're talking to. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which gives the SEC jurisdiction over foreign bad conduct that involves U.S. accounting, or someone that's a registrant in the United States. Well, if that's not at play, it's kind of hard to find jurisdiction to where you may be able to join a program. They've set it up so you can now have that jurisdiction. If it's a private company and it's foreign, you can now fit into a program. So those are the kind of programs that you have out there. Generally, so you think of like fraud in the government, that's going to be the False Claims Act. And then you have fraud in private individuals or involving, so securities fraud, commodities fraud, market manipulation, tax fraud, and that is sort of catch-all with the Department of Justice. Also, money laundering with the AML program. That's it. So I de-emphasize the rewards on these. I just gave you the odds. It's not great. You really got to think about doing this because it's the right thing to do, and you really want to do it for the right reasons, and you're motivated to do it for a very long period of time. Like the case study we're talking about that we're sticking to here. I mean, 5 years in, and we're still going, and they go for a very long period of time because, I mean, for a company like Morgan Stanley or Interactive Brokers to settle a matter, I mean, that takes years for the government to investigate, then resolve, and then you have to apply for the award. So it's just a long haul. And I don't think people should really get excited about that. I think you really got to think about doing it for the right reasons because you care about what the issue is, that you're passionate about it, because that's the thing you're going to be living with.
And Phil, even if you are considering, if someone is considering the whistleblower route, what could go wrong? Like, what things should they be thinking about? Maybe that might make them not want to go that route.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question. And I think that when you think about getting into a program, like the reasons, like not to do it, I think maybe that you, in fact, are the orchestrator of the crime. I think that would be a bad idea. Okay, let's just say that if you set up, yeah, you're the one doing it. Let's not go to the government and like point that out. You should go to the government and talk to them, but that would be with the defense lawyer, and you'd be proffering your conduct for credit for volunteering that. So, okay, let's not be the organizer of the crime. I don't think Luis Rodriguez would be a good person to apply for a reward that we're talking about. So I think that. I think one of the things that I think is people that don't have firsthand information, there's a whole sphere out there, people that sort of data mine information for fraud. My experience, and this is just my experience, except in the sort of very technical market manipulation cases, the government wants firsthand information. They want you to know what happened. So they want you to know about the fraudulent conduct and be able to speak about it and be a witness. And what they want to be able to do there is make sure that it's actual fraudulent conduct and it's just not a mistake, an error. So it's really important that you have firsthand information. If you don't, you got to really think through that whole process. Some of the other things that would cause me to kind of shy away from it too would be personal. And I think any good lawyer is going to do this. If you've had potentially, and I sit down and clients talk to this all the time, like, what's your mental state? Like, how do you feel? Have you had problems in the past? Like, have you had mental health problems? Have you had a substance abuse problem? Are you maybe potentially on the brink of divorce with your spouse? Are you the sole breadwinner? Do you take care of your mother? Like, if you take care of your mother and you're the person in her life who, comes over every day and you're buying groceries and you're taking, maybe this is not a good idea for you because this is going to be so stressful for you that it's going to disrupt your life and harm either you or people around you. And maybe it's not worth it. So you really have to kind of assess like where you are personally. And I think a good lawyer is going to do that. Because, my starting point, is do no harm. Like, I don't want any bad things to happen to my clients. I don't want my clients to become destitute or, end up on, in just a, in a terrible position in life that they weren't in before. That was caused by the very thing that we're doing. And that was foreseeable. So I think that's healthy. It's kind of like gut check about who you are. Like, what are you ready for? I would describe it like this. I mean, the way I think about these cases is that you have to think about it as a trip, a journey, and you're going to leave one place and you're going to go to another place. And during the course of that trip, you're going to reach a point where you're not going to be able to turn back. You're on this journey that is, you're either going to get there or sink. And you really have to have the mindset to do that because it's real. I mean, this is no joke. I mean, this is not a video game. This is not true crime TV. This is the real story. So I think that the other thing I would just say, make sure you're getting into a whistle program. I mentioned that the woman at Treasury who went to jail, she gave out information. The federal government does have a whistleblower program for employees. She didn't use that. She gave it to a journalist. They were very sensitive documents. I used it in my case. I'll be frank on that. At that point, it was a public document. But yeah, you got to make sure you're fitting into a program. So those are kind of the things that I think you need to think about going into it. I mean, each person's going to have a different risk tolerance. Everybody's different. I mean, some people can manage a lot of risk, and some people are very conservative.
If someone is in a situation now, they have witnessed wrongdoing, they're pretty sure it's not a mistake. Um, what are the steps? What do you advise them to do right now?
First thing I would tell you is go talk to an attorney. That would be the first thing I would do. The second thing I would say is don't wait. The programs we're talking about are seeking actionable intelligence. They don't want old information. They want new information that they can act on right away. Information that's 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, they don't care. I mean, they have other pressing issues that are right in front of them. So you have to go quick. I think that you shouldn't download information. If you're still employed, don't do anything. Go and talk to your lawyer. There are ways to deal with things. And I will just warn people out there that are watching this. Companies have very sophisticated software to know if you're doing a document dump. If you're downloading a lot of information, the software in the computer, in the system, will warn about that. So there's ways to manage around that and gather the information you need. And everybody has a cell phone right now. Your phone is a beautiful camera, and you can take pictures of things and not have to move to physical media. A lot of laptops now, obviously, at companies, they don't even have, like, you can't even slide electronic media in. I would say that don't be your own PR person. Don't talk to the media. Don't do those things. I've seen that. It is not good. You've not done this before, likely, and you're putting yourself at a lot of risk. And then, again, I'm one attorney. I mean, like, if people are out there that are in that position or like listening to this, there's the Anti-Fraud Coalition. I'm a member. There's a whole list of lawyers there that you can go to. The Anti-Fraud Coalition is plaintiff side only lawyers, no defense lawyers, and you can go there and check it out. There are lawyers you can go and talk to, and we're there. I mean, the people that do this kind of work are they'll pick up the phone, they'll talk to you, they'll still give you some time. So that's what I would say.
Phil, I wonder if you can flag for us issues on the horizon. Where are you seeing areas of either corruption or illicit business practices that should be on folks' radar?
Yeah, so I see a lot. I'm not a policy person by any means, but I do see common themes. And what I would say is there's three things that I think are going to kind of come around. One, I think that tariff fraud with the new administration is going to be a big deal. That is going to be a really hot topic. And when you think of tariff fraud, you're thinking, like, what does that have to do with, like, illicit finance and money laundering? Well, tariff fraud, what you're generally doing is hiding the origins of something. So in this case, we're dealing with Chinese products. And what you do is basically transship them. So you send them to a second country and then obscure its origins and then ship it to the United States as that product. Now, that sounds a lot like layering, doesn't it? Yeah. It sounds like money laundering. And we know in money laundering that trade launder is a real thing. Trade launder is a big, very, very big area that goes on. So I think that that's going to be a really hot area given the administration's interest in tariffs. Now, what happens is if you don't pay tariffs, you've omitted a payment. We call it a reverse false claim. You've kept money that you should have given to the government. And depending on the rate, it's 25%. That adds up very quickly. So you have a 25% fine that wasn't paid that you owe to the government. Plus, if it's not marked properly, you can add another 10% onto it. So effectively, for every $1 million that is imported to the United States, $350,000 wasn't paid that's owed to customs. And if you know about that and it goes on for a long period of time, that adds up to a lot of money. And the way the program works there, it's triple damages. And then the relator gets 15 to 20% of that as a reward for bringing the claim. So I think that's going to be a big area. I think it's going to be a really hot topic. The other topic I think is going to be big is we've talked a lot about these offshore companies. I think that the rating agencies that rate offshore companies should pay keen attention to the companies that they're rating. I think that they give a seal of approval to companies that allows them to do business. And I think that given the enhanced focus on money laundering and stopping it and rooting it out, that companies that are rating companies that get caught doing this, I think are going to get in a lot of trouble. And I think that's going to be an area that grows. And finally, I think this is close to your heart, is in the crypto world. I think that we're going to see less of these big policy debates about crypto. I think with the change of administration, I think it's going to be less about, the legal structure of crypto, I think it's going to be a lot more about fraud enforcement. I think that's where we're going to see. I think we're going to see a lot more fraud enforcement. I think the resources that have been spent on these policy debates, and they've been very vigorous, I think are going to turn more to enforcement. I mean, my view to crypto is very straightforward. I mean, it's here. It's not going away. We can't run or hide from it. If the crypto is going to exist in the world and it's going to be a financial product, America should be the best at it, and we should be at the forefront of it, because it's not something we can evade in a global world. So, and I think that I was talking to you earlier before we were thinking about doing the show. I investigated a case, and this is the kind of stuff that I think that the government's going to be more interested in. I was looking at a crypto firm that was offering to take your physical gold and give you crypto, and then you could take that crypto and give it to anybody else and get gold in return. And as you know, the United States and Europe, gold is a huge currency for the illicit markets. I mean, we don't think about that here. I know, Yaya, you're well aware about how important gold is to the world, when it comes to illicit finance, and it's a very important payment means. But I think that's going to be more important, going to be kind of coming to the forefront. I think crypto is going to see more enforcement on fraud, and that's going to be kind of the development that I see. And that, and I frankly, my view is that, crypto is kind of interesting. If I was to be a launderer, I wouldn't like crypto because of the blockchain. I mean, I think that that's the thing that, I think there's a lot of things that are very anti-AML associated with crypto and blockchain that can actually thwart, people from engaging in, illicit conduct. And I think there's a lot of other ways, if you're really trying to move money, when you really want to do it in a way that it's anonymous. There are a lot of more traditional ways to do it that are a lot easier. So, and I'm no expert in crypto. It's just, sort of what I've seen and what I've sort of been, looking at. But yeah, those are the trends. And
Yeah, thank you. Phil, you've been doing this for a while. I'm wondering if you could tell us, why do you do this work and how did you get to it?
Yeah, like I started my career, I worked in big international law firms. I was in-house counsel at a public company. I was North American counsel for a European company. I started my own firm. And, when I was in law school, I was in a program, the Department of Justice in the criminal division, where I worked in an international office, an international criminal assistance office. And I was exposed at a very young age to the world of illegal finance and the rule of law. And in fact, I even went to your old employer at the CIA as part of like the whole sort of summer recruitment program that they ran. And, I really thought it was truly fascinating and very interesting. And I thought I would always come back to it. Oftentimes in life, I think we think our careers are not linear. We're always sort of bouncing around, but there tends to be a theme and a trend. We sort of go back to what motivates us in the beginning. And that's been the case for me. I've kind of come back to what I did my first year in law school. I find it very interesting. I think it makes a difference. And I'll tell you, frankly, for me, like, why do I keep doing it? And it's a fair question. It's difficult. You don't make a lot of friends along the way. You make a lot of enemies. I have a really, really special job because I get to watch people commit acts of courage. I watch people walk into federal buildings voluntarily after being told the odds. I tell them every bad possible outcome. That's my job. I don't want to get sued for malpractice. I tell them everything. And also because I care. And I tell them, like, this is what's likely to happen. This is, the things we discussed today. And they look at you and they say, sure, let's go. And they walk right in. And you see them tell the truth. And you see them believe in the system. And I find it to be a very profound experience, frankly. I mean, it's deeply moving to watch people live out, their values, the values of America, what makes this country great. That kids look, they believe that they can go and talk to their government and tell them what's going on. And I have the opportunity to be there and make a difference. And, I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. The ups and downs, the long delays, it's par for the course. But when you know that is what people are doing and you get to help them, I think it's rewarding in and of itself. And I'd keep doing it till, I retire or, I do something else in this world. But I don't suspect that I will, and I'll continue on this path until, I finish this career.
When it comes to whistleblowers, as celebrated as they are in movies or covered in the press, not everyone is built for blowing the whistle. It takes not just intestinal fortitude and a great deal of patience, but also an unfailing moral compass to persevere through the grueling experience where those you expose often do their best to make you doubt yourself. I shouldn't call what Phil does as work. Clearly, he sees it as a mission. And although he doesn't work for a government agency or wear a badge, he most definitely still is a financial crime fighter. Only Phil fights with a legal brief. So, if you're ever going to step out and take a huge risk to do the right thing, don't do it alone. Call Phil. I'm Yaya Jata Finuse, and this is Designated on the Illicit Edge Network.